Oh, you want to hear about the Great Slap of 2387? The one that literally redrew 3-star charts and caused the Galactic Senate to implement what they now call the Miranda Protocols? Well, buckle up, Buttercup, because this is a story that starts with diplomatic immunity and ends with someone needing a new face. Let me paint you a picture of the Zarathi Empire. Imagine if someone took every bad stereotype about pompous aristocrats, cranked it up to 11, then gave them laser weapons and the collective intelligence of a particularly dim houseplant. According to YouTube analytics, 98% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. The Zarathi had conquered half the galaxy not through superior tactics or technology, but through sheer bloody-minded stubbornness and the kind of arrogance that makes you wonder if evolution was taking a coffee break when it made them. They stood 9 feet tall on average, had skin like purple leather that had been left in the sun too long, and facial tentacles that they used to express emotions, which was unfortunate, because the only emotions they seemed capable of expressing were contempt, rage, and that special kind of smugness that makes you want to introduce someone's face to a brick wall. Repeatedly. Their society was built on something they called the Great Chain of Dominion, which was essentially a fancy way of saying might makes right, with extra steps and more tentacle waving. At the top of this chain sat Emperor Vorthak the Undefeated, a title he'd given himself after winning exactly one battle against a species that had literally just invented the wheel. The Zarathi measured strength purely by physical dominance, and they'd spent the last 3 centuries proving to the galaxy that they could punch things really, really hard. Which brings us to Earth, and humanity's recent induction into the galactic community. We joined about 5 years prior, after finally developing faster-than-light travel and immediately running into a Zarathi patrol ship. The first words humanity heard from the greater galaxy were roughly translated as, "Surrender your pathetic vessels, weak flesh creatures." Our response, delivered by Captain Rodriguez of the UES Determination, was considerably less diplomatic and involved several suggestions about what the Zarathi could do with their tentacles that violated at least 3 laws of physics. The humans, as it turned out, were something of an oddity in galactic society. Most species that achieved space travel had evolved past physical violence. The Kelvani settled disputes through interpretive dance. The Zephyrians used mathematical proofs. The Glimmerwing Collective just sang really sad songs until everyone felt too guilty to fight. Humans, on the other hand, had achieved faster-than-light travel while still maintaining what the galactic anthropologists politely termed aggressive tendencies, and what everyone else called an alarming willingness to hit things with other things. We were the galactic equivalent of that one friend who brings fireworks to a wine tasting. The Galactic Senate, in their infinite wisdom, decided that the best way to integrate humanity was through cultural exchange programs, which is how we ended up with Ambassador Miranda Chen, a woman who had previously served as both a diplomat and, in her younger days, a championship boxer. The Senate, bless their naive little hearts, thought this combination of skills would help her relate to the physicality-oriented Zarathi culture. They had no idea what they were unleashing. Miranda was 5'6" of concentrated diplomatic fury, with black hair she kept in a practical bun, and the kind of smile that made career politicians nervous. She'd earned her diplomatic credentials negotiating trade disputes in the asteroid belt, where aggressive negotiation tactics often involved actual aggression. The woman could discuss agricultural tariffs while calculating the exact force needed to break someone's nose, and she did both with the same professional competence. Her assignment was straightforward: attend the Grand Assembly of the Zarathi Empire, where they were unveiling their new Dominion Protocols, essentially a fancy way of demanding tribute from every other species in the galaxy. Humanity was invited to witness this ceremony, though invited might be too generous a term. Commanded to attend so you can grovel properly was closer to the actual invitation. The Grand Assembly was held on Zarathi Prime, in a massive amphitheater that looked like someone had taken a Roman Colosseum, painted it purple, and added entirely too many spikes. The architecture screamed, "Compensation issues," so loudly it could probably be heard from orbit. 10,000 Zarathi nobles filled the stands, their tentacles writhing in what passed for applause among their kind. Miranda arrived wearing her formal diplomatic attire, a crisp blue uniform with the United Earth insignia, practical shoes that could double as weapons if necessary, and the kind of expression that suggested she was already calculating which parts of the ceremony she could sleep through without causing an international incident. She was assigned a place in the lesser species section, between the ambassador from the squeaking mouse people of Reginald VII and a very apologetic representative from the Floating Jellyfish Confederation who kept accidentally shocking everyone. The entire setup was designed to emphasize the Zarathi superiority complex, with the lesser species seated far below the elevated Zarathi nobility. Emperor Vorthak himself was a specimen that would have made Charles Darwin weep. 12 feet of purple muscle and ego, with tentacles that moved like he was conducting an orchestra of his own self-importance. His voice, when he spoke, sounded like gravel in a blender mixed with the dying screams of his enemy's dignity. "Behold," he declared, his tentacles writhing dramatically, "the new age of Zarathi dominion. All lesser species shall provide tribute, acknowledge our supremacy, and prostrate themselves before our magnificent." Miranda yawned, audibly. The amphitheater fell silent. 10,000 alien eyes turned toward the small human woman who had apparently just committed the galactic equivalent of interrupting the Pope during Easter Mass. Vorthak's tentacles went rigid. Did that tiny flesh creature just yawn during my proclamation of universal dominance? Miranda looked around with the kind of innocent expression that had fooled exactly 0 people throughout her entire career. "I'm sorry, Your Emperorness. Was I not supposed to? It's just that we have a saying on Earth. Same circus, different clowns. And, well..." She gestured at the elaborate ceremony around them. "This is basically Tuesday for us." A collective gasp rose from the lesser species section. The squeaking mouse people started squeaking in panic. The floating jellyfish began shocking themselves in distress. Even the usually stoic rock people started grinding nervously. But Miranda? Miranda was just getting started. "I mean, don't get me wrong," she continued, her voice carrying clearly through the amphitheater's acoustics. "This is very impressive. The spikes, the purple everything, the dramatic tentacle waving. Very compensatory. But if we're talking about actual dominion, well..." She pulled out a small data pad. "According to our intelligence, the Zarathi Empire controls what, maybe 12% of the galaxy? That's cute. Earth's internet cats control more territory than that." Vorthak's face was turning an interesting shade of violet that probably wasn't medically advisable. "How dare you mock the mighty Zarathi Empire? We have conquered countless worlds, brought low the proud civilizations of..." "Oh, the balloon people of Squeakington," Miranda interrupted, consulting her datapad again. "Yeah, we looked into that. They surrendered because you threatened to pop them, and they're literally filled with helium. That's not conquest, that's bullying a birthday party." The Emperor's tentacles began moving so rapidly they were practically buzzing. Around the amphitheater, Zarathi nobles were making sounds that the universal translators were rendering as variations of, "Oh snap," and "She did not just say that." "And the great victory over the crystal gardens of Zephyr III?" Miranda continued, clearly on a roll. "You do realize those were literally gardens, right? They didn't fight back because they were plants. You basically declared war on a salad and claimed victory." At this point, Vorthak was vibrating with rage. His tentacles had formed what could only be described as angry knots, and his voice rose to a pitch that was making several species in the audience cover their auditory organs. "Silence, inferior creature! You forget yourself! You are addressing Vorthak the Undefeated, ruler of..." "Yeah, about that undefeated thing," Miranda said, standing up from her seat with the casual confidence of someone who had clearly stopped caring about diplomatic consequences. "We did some research on that too. Turns out you're undefeated because you've literally only fought one actual battle, against the wheel inventors of primitive EV, And even then, it took you 3 days to beat a species that was still figuring out basic circular technology. The silence in the amphitheater was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop in another solar system. Vorthak's face was now cycling through colors that didn't exist in most species' visible spectrum. Furthermore, Miranda continued, because apparently she had decided to commit to this course of action with the dedication of someone jumping off a cliff, your mighty empire seems to specialize in threatening people who can't fight back. Real brave, picking on farmers and flowers and folks who haven't figured out pointy sticks yet. This was the moment when Vorthak made a decision that would be studied in military academies for the next 1,000 years as an example of what not to do when you're already losing an argument. He stood up. All 12 feet of him rose from his throne, tentacles writhing in patterns that the universal translators were too polite to interpret. His guards, massive Zarathi warriors in ceremonial armor, tensed as their emperor began descending the steps toward the lesser species section. "You dare mock the power of the Zarathi?" he roared, his voice echoing off the amphitheater walls. "You pathetic, soft, weak creature. I will show you the strength that has conquered worlds." Miranda watched him approach with the kind of calm that comes from either supreme confidence or complete resignation to one's fate. Possibly both. The other ambassadors in the lesser species section were frantically trying to distance themselves from the suddenly very dangerous human. Vorthak reached Miranda's row and loomed over her, all 12 feet of purple rage and wounded pride. His tentacles cast shadows across her face as he raised one massive hand. "Kneel before your superior, flesh creature," he snarled. "Acknowledge the dominance of the Zarathi Empire, or I will demonstrate why we rule and you serve." Miranda looked up at him with the kind of smile that probably made small children hide behind their parents. "You know what, your tentacleness? I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding here. The only misunderstanding," Vorthak rumbled, "is your failure to recognize your betters." And then he slapped her. Not a gentle disciplinary tap, not a symbolic gesture. A full-force, 12-foot-tall alien emperor slap that sent Miranda staggering backward and left a mark that would be visible for days. The sound echoed through the amphitheater like a gunshot. The assembled lesser species gasped in horror. The Zarathi nobles chittered with approval. Emperor Vorthak stood there, tentacles writhing in satisfaction, believing he had just demonstrated the natural order of the universe. He had no idea what he had just unleashed. Miranda straightened slowly, touched her cheek where a purple bruise was already forming, and smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the kind of smile that evolution had designed as a warning system for dangerous predators. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Now you've gone and done it." Vorthak's tentacles slowed their satisfied writhing. Something in her tone was setting off alarms in whatever passed for his survival instincts. "You want to know about dominance?" Miranda asked, rolling her shoulders in a way that suggested she was loosening up for exercise. "You want to talk about who rules and who serves? Let me explain something about humans that apparently didn't make it into your intelligence reports." She took a step forward. Vorthak, despite being twice her height and 3 times her mass, took an involuntary step backward. "We don't have a dominance hierarchy based on size," Miranda continued, her voice getting quieter and somehow more terrifying. "We have something better. We have a dominance hierarchy based on who's willing to hit back harder than they got hit." The Emperor's tentacles were starting to move in what might have been nervousness. Around the amphitheater, the assembled aliens were getting that horrible, fascinated feeling you get when you're about to witness either a disaster or a miracle. "And the thing about humans," Miranda said, flexing her fingers in a way that suggested she was remembering old muscle memory, "is that we've been hitting things for our entire evolutionary history. We figured out tools specifically so we could hit things better. We domesticated wolves so they could help us hit things. We invented mathematics so we could calculate the optimal angle for hitting things." She was still advancing. Vorthak was still retreating. his face cycling through colors that suggested his confidence was evaporating faster than water on Mercury. "We are," Miranda concluded, "really, really good at hitting things." That was when she hit him. Now, let me be clear about something. Miranda Chen was not a large woman. She was not enhanced with cybernetics or alien technology. She was not wearing powered armor or wielding advanced weapons. She was a 5'6" human diplomat who had learned to box in her youth and had spent the last few minutes being publicly humiliated by a 12-foot purple emperor in front of the entire galactic community. What she was, however, was absolutely, utterly, completely furious. The slap she delivered would be analyzed by scientists for decades afterward. They would study the biomechanics, the kinetic energy transfer, the precise angle and rotation that allowed a human arm to generate that much force. They would create elaborate mathematical models and write papers with titles like Theoretical Applications of Primate Aggression in Xenobiological Contexts. None of that captured the simple, beautiful, terrifying reality of what happened when Miranda's hand connected with Emperor Vorthak's face. The sound was like a thunderclap. The force of it lifted the Emperor off his feet and sent him flying backward through the air in a perfect arc. He crashed into his own throne with enough impact to crack the stone and knocked himself unconscious in front of 10,000 of his own subjects. The silence that followed was so profound that several species later claimed they could hear their own hearts beating. Miranda stood there, hand still raised from the follow-through, looking down at the unconscious Emperor with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for people who had just solved a really difficult puzzle. Finally, she turned to address the amphitheater. Her voice carried clearly in the stunned silence. "Right then," she said cheerfully, "I believe we were discussing tribute arrangements." What happened next would reshape galactic politics for the next century. The Zarathi nobles, faced with the sight of their undefeated emperor, unconscious and drooling on his own throne, did what any reasonable warrior culture would do when confronted with someone who had just demonstrated superior fighting ability. They knelt. All of them. 10,000 purple aliens, dropping to their knees in perfect unison, tentacles writhing in what the translators identified as submission and "please don't hit us too." The lesser species section erupted in chaos. The squeaking mouse people were squeaking in excitement. The floating jellyfish were shocking each other in celebration. The rock people were doing whatever it is that rocks do when they're happy, which apparently involved a lot of grinding. Miranda looked around at the scene with a kind of bewilderment usually reserved for people who had accidentally started a revolution while trying to order coffee. She said eloquently. "This is awkward." That was when Vorthak regained consciousness. He came to slowly, his tentacles twitching as awareness returned. When he saw Miranda standing over him and his entire noble class kneeling in submission, his face went through approximately 17 different colors before settling on a shade of purple that suggested he was either about to explode or achieve enlightenment. He struggled to his feet, swaying slightly, and stared at the human woman who had just fundamentally altered his understanding of the universe. "You," he said slowly. "You are strong." Miranda shrugged. "I'm human. We're all like this." This was, of course, a massive exaggeration. Miranda was actually considered quite restrained by human standards, but Vorthak didn't need to know that. The Emperor's tentacles writhed in what the translators identified as thoughtful consideration mixed with terror. "Your species," he said carefully. "How many of you are there?" "Oh, about 8 billion on Earth alone," Miranda replied casually. "Plus colonies, and that's not counting. The ones who are specifically trained for fighting. Those ones make me look like a kindergarten teacher." Vorthak's face went through several more impossible colors. 8 billion of you. Give or take. Why? The Emperor looked around at his kneeling nobles, at his cracked throne, at the various species who were no longer looking terrified of Zarathi dominance. When he spoke again, his voice had the hollow quality of someone who had just realized they'd been playing a game where they didn't understand the rules. "I would like to discuss a treaty," he said quietly. And that's how the Great Slap of 2387 ended the age of Zarathi expansion and ushered in what historians would later call the Human Accord period. The treaty that followed was remarkably simple. The Zarathi would stop demanding tribute from other species. Humanity would not share the exact details of human military capability with the rest of the galaxy, and everyone would pretend that this had all been part of a carefully planned diplomatic strategy rather than the result of someone getting slapped and slapping back harder. The Zarathi, it turned out, adapted to their new reality with surprising grace. Once they got over the initial shock of discovering that physical dominance might not be the universal constant they'd assumed, they proved quite reasonable to negotiate with. They even developed something resembling a sense of humor, though it mostly involved making jokes about how they used to be the scary ones. Emperor Vorthak became something of a celebrity in certain circles as the leader who had been humbled by a diplomat and lived to tell about it. He eventually wrote a best-selling memoir titled The Tentacle and the Fist, a meditation on strength, which included a surprisingly thoughtful chapter on the differences between dominance and leadership. Miranda, meanwhile, became the most requested diplomat in human space. Her approach to negotiations became known as the Miranda method, which essentially boiled down to be polite until politeness stops working, then demonstrate why politeness was working in the first place. She never had to slap another alien leader. Word got around quickly that humans were not to be trifled with, and most species found it much easier to simply negotiate in good faith than to risk finding out what other capabilities the newcomers might be hiding. The Galactic Senate eventually codified the lessons learned from the incident into what became known as the Miranda Protocols, a set of guidelines for interspecies diplomacy that essentially boiled down to, don't hit humans unless you're prepared to get hit back, and humans hit really, really hard. But the real victory wasn't the treaty or the protocols or the complete restructuring of galactic power dynamics. The real victory was what happened afterward, when the various species of the galaxy realized that they no longer had to live in fear of the Zarathi Empire's expansion. The balloon people of Squeakington inflated a giant parade balloon in Miranda's honor. The crystal gardens of Zephyr III grew an entire memorial grove. The wheel inventors of primitive I-4 finally got around to inventing the axle, partly because they were no longer worried about being invaded before they figured it out. And somewhere in the archives of the Galactic Senate, there's a recording of the incident that's become required viewing for all diplomatic students. It's usually introduced with the note, "This is why we have procedures for cultural integration, and why those procedures include comprehensive background checks on species conflict resolution methods." Miranda herself retired from active diplomacy 5 years later and opened a martial arts academy on Earth, where she taught a course called Practical Applications of Diplomatic Theory. The waiting list was 3 years long and included students from 17 different species. The last anyone heard, Emperor Vorthak had taken up meditation and started a blog about personal growth. His most popular post was titled, "That Time I Got My Face Rearranged by a Human and Learned the True Meaning of Strength." And the moral of the story? Well, there are several, depending on who you ask. The diplomatic corps likes to say it's about the importance of understanding cultural differences before making assumptions. The military historians prefer to focus on the tactical implications of underestimating human combat capabilities. But Miranda herself, when asked about the incident years later, just smiled that same dangerous smile and said, "Sometimes the best diplomacy is a firm handshake. Sometimes it's a slap upside the head. The trick is knowing which one the situation calls for." She paused, considering. Though, to be fair, I probably could have handled that one better. Next time someone slaps me in front of 10,000 witnesses, I'll try to remember to ask them politely to stop first. When the interviewer asked if she thought there would be a next time, Miranda's smile got a little wider. "Well," she said, "humans are still pretty new to this whole galactic community thing. We're bound to run into more cultural misunderstandings." The interviewer, who happened to be Zarathi, involuntarily wrapped his tentacles around his face in what looked suspiciously like a protective gesture. "Don't worry," Miranda added kindly. We're fast learners, and we're getting better at the whole diplomacy first, violence second thing. She thought about it for a moment, most of the time. And that, dear readers, is the story of how one human diplomat slapped her way into the history books and accidentally created a more peaceful galaxy in the process. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important diplomatic breakthroughs come not from carefully crafted treaties or elegant negotiations, but from someone finally standing up and saying, "That's enough." Of course, it helps if you can back that up with the kind of slap that rearranges furniture, but that's just good diplomatic practice.